wasn't the termination that broke me. It was the laughter. Dr. Albright, my supervisor at the Department of Agriculture, leaned back in his leather chair. A report I'd spent 3 sleepless weeks compiling sitting on his desk between us. My report on the 16 missing cattle from the Harlow farmstead. My report on the strange, pale gray soil I'd found in the north pasture. Soil that felt hungry. He picked it up, waved it dismissively, and chuckled. A wet, condescending sound. "Elias," he said, his eyes twinkling with pity. "Cursed soil, crops that mimic what they consume. This isn't science. This is rural superstition. It's embarrassing." He slid a pink slip across the polished mahogany. Betrayal has a sound, you know. It's not a gunshot. It's the quiet, smooth whisper of paper on wood, sealing your professional death. The intellectual dismissal was a blade in the gut, but the laughter was the poison that followed. My exile began with a drive home, a box of my personal effects in the passenger seat, and Albright's mockery echoing in my ears. I went back to my family's farm, the place I'd fought so hard to escape. My father, a man whose hands were as cracked and practical as the land he worked, just shook his head. "Dirt voodoo, Eli? Is that what they taught you at that fancy college?" My brother, Mark, who'd stayed and become everything my father wanted, was worse. "Heard you got fired for chasing ghosts in the mud," he'd sneer over dinner. "Bringing shame on the family name with this insanity." They gave me the old cellar, a damp, stone-walled space that smelled of earth and forgotten things. It became my sanctuary and my prison. I turned it into a lab. Shelves lined with soil samples in hermetically sealed jars, each labeled with a location, a date, and a story. The ashen earth from a forgotten graveyard where nothing ever grew. The greasy black loam from a bog that had swallowed a child a century ago. And the centerpiece of my obsession, a lead-lined container holding the pale, unnervingly fine soil from Harlow Farm. My family called it my freak show. They'd have friends over, and I'd hear Mark's voice from upstairs, laced with theatrical warning. "Don't go in the basement, my brother's down there, communing with his haunted dirt." The laughter that followed was a phantom limb of Albright's. Just as cruel, just as sharp. But down there in the quiet hum of my centrifuges and under the glow of my microscopes, I was finding the truth. The pale soil from Harlow Farm, it wasn't just sterile. It was receptive. I grew a simple radish in it. After a week, the root hadn't just grown. It had twisted itself into a perfect miniature effigy of a sheep's skull. I filmed it. I documented everything. The soil was a memory bank, a hungry archive. It didn't just kill. It remembered what it took, and it reshaped life into a grotesque monument of its consumption. This was my field, not superstition. Agri-paranormal soil science, and I was its sole obsessed practitioner. The rot I warned Albright about began to spread. Not a fungus, not a blight, but a creeping sterilization of land that bordered places like Harlow Farm. Reports trickled in from other states, other countries, patches of earth turning pallid and gray. Livestock vanishing, strange malformed vegetation. I developed containment protocols. Lead-infused gloves, respiratory gear that filtered not just particulates but something else, something I could only describe as influence. The soil whispered. It showed you things in the corner of your eye, fleeting images of loss, of decay. It fed on despair as much as it did on flesh and bone. To work with it was to stand on the edge of a psychological abyss every single day. More than one of my online contacts went silent. And I knew the soil had claimed them, one way or another. My triumph wasn't a shiny award or a headline in a scientific journal. It was a phone call from a black-suited man with no name, asking me to consult on a land management issue at a private estate in Virginia. I named Webb Price. He didn't blink. I had survived. I had mastered the field they mocked. I was no longer a disgrace. I was a specialist in the world's most terrifying, secret plague. I was the man they called when the earth itself became a monster. The call I never expected but always dreaded came 2 years later. It was my father. His voice, usually a bedrock of unshakable pragmatism, was spin, frayed with a fear he couldn't hide. "Eli, the south field. It's turning gray. The corn. God, the corn isn't right." I returned home not as the failed son, but as a renowned authority on the horror they'd refused to believe in. I pulled up in a nondescript black truck, my gear in sterile locked cases in the back. My father, my mother, and Mark were waiting on the porch. The years had carved new lines into their faces. Mark's smugness was gone, replaced by a hollow-eyed anxiety. "Thank God you're here," my mother whispered, wringing her hands. I didn't offer comfort. I just nodded, pulled on my gloves, and walked to the south field. It was there, the pale, dead-looking soil, spreading like a disease from the fence line. I knelt, took a sample, and sealed it in a containment vial. Back in the house, I placed the vial on the kitchen table. They had once laughed around at my expense. "Nobody touches this," I said. My voice was different now, colder, heavier. Mark, trying to reclaim some semblance of his old self, scoffed. "It's just dirt, Eli." "No," I said, my eyes locking with his. "It's not." From my main case, I retrieved the sample from Harlow Farm, still in its lead-lined box. I set it next to the vial from their field. "This is the alpha sample," I explained. "This is where it began." And then it happened. In the sterile silence of the kitchen, the soil in the vial from my father's field began to move. It wasn't a tremor. It was a slow, deliberate coalescing. The pale grains shifted, rising, knitting together. My mother gasped, stumbling back against the counter. My father's face went white. It was forming a shape. Small, delicate. A shape they all recognized. The shape of a tiny hand. The fingers curled just so. The shape of the infant daughter they had lost 30 years ago to a fever. A secret grief they never, ever spoke of. The soil knew. It had been listening to their sorrow, feeding on the memory buried deep within the family's own private earth. Mark stared, his breath catching in a choked sob. The intellectual dismissal, the years of mockery, the smug superiority, it all crumbled to dust in the face of that tiny, terrible hand made of cursed soil. He was seeing the truth not as a theory, but as a violation of his most sacred, painful memory. He finally understood. I calmly capped the sample, the shape collapsing back into inert dust. I looked at their shattered faces, at my brother who was openly weeping, at my parents who were staring at me not as their son, but as a stranger who could stand in the presence of such a thing and not break. The laughter was gone forever. In its place was a silence more profound and more chilling than any ridicule. I had my vindication. But as I packed my gear, the quiet hum of the containment unit a lonely counterpoint to my family's ragged breathing. I knew the truth. They weren't just afraid of the soil anymore. They were afraid of me. And in that, I felt the true cold weight of my victory. I had saved them from the rot in the ground, but I had shown them the rot in their own disbelief. And now, a chasm stood between us that no apology could ever cross. The earth remembers everything, and sometimes so does a son.